Thank you once again for joining me during these live internet studies. My name is Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi. This is segment one of two segments. This is an hour-long live study. An hour is given over to eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events, and 30 minutes is given over to a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism. So I hope you can stick around for both topics. What you can see on your screen right now is the topical index or schedule of this particular segment one, eschatology. And we've already worked our way through topics 1 through 5. We're now on topic 6, Excursus, Antichrist, according to Robert Van Kampen. Let's jump right back in where we left off last week. We're talking about these notes. We're borrowing these notes from Van Kampen's book, The Sign, which you can get on Amazon. All right, here's where we left off. I backed up one paragraph. I'm not going to elaborate on the paragraph. I'll just read through it and then we'll keep going. See if we can make a little bit more progress, because I think you guys are getting it based on the feedback that I'm getting from YouTube and the emails that I'm interacting with. And so I'm delighted that this is kicking in. Here's what Van Kampen has to say. First, a little history. We're looking at, by the way, Antichrist, the future leader who's, according to the futurist model that I hold to, and that many Christians also hold to, versus the preterist model. In the futurist model, there's a future man who's going to hit the scene, who's going to interact with Israel first, and then with the rest of the world as well. His relationship with Israel is going to spill out over into the rest of the world. And so, to the degree that I understand, Scripture teaches that we will be around when the Antichrist is introduced into human history. I believe that these words and these studies are relevant for us. But in order to gain a better appreciation for understanding the actions of Antichrist and his dealings with Israel, we're taking a look at a forerunner to Antichrist known as Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV. Epiphanes was a name that he gave to himself, which means God manifest. And he lived in the first, like the 200 years prior to the first century. So he lived in a time period before before Jesus walked the scene. You can read about him in history, in your history books, or you can read about him in a Maccabean book of the Bible, book of Maccabees, etc. So we're looking at the future Antichrist as seen through the activities of the forerunner to Antichrist, Antiochus Epiphanes. So, first, a little history. This is Van Kampen. Speaking of ancient Israel, long after the end of her own monarchies and after most of the exiles had returned to the promised land, so we're talking about the time period leading up to the time period of the Maccabees, right, 200 years before Christ, God's chosen nation, the natural line of Abraham, they continued and persisted in ever-increasing apostasy, which is, again, no surprise. Israel gets herself into hot water and into trouble. They cry out to God for a deliverer. God rescues them, and then no sooner than he rescues them and delivers them from their oppressors, then they start playing the harlot and disobeying God again. So they were persisting in ever-increasing apostasy once again. Because of their blatant disbelief and disobedience, the Lord not only allowed his nation to be conquered and persecuted by an increasingly cruel pagan oppressor named Antiochus Epiphanes, which we learned from history that he's the Greek king of Syria, but God even permitted his own holy temple in Jerusalem to be profaned. And this was really, if you remember, within the context of what God had already told Daniel would happen to his people, even though at the time that Daniel was being written, Daniel's people, Israel, were already in exile in Babylon. God promised, I'm going to bring you out of exile, bring you back into your land, but then there's going to be some events that are going to lead to the temple being destroyed again and your people being kicked out of the land again. I mean, Daniel had to probably pull his hair out in frustration with what God was actually showing him. All right, let's continue. Van Kampen says, an informative and vivid picture of Antiochus is found in the apocryphal book of First Maccabees, which, although not being inspired scripture, nonetheless provides reliable historical information about that time that we're looking at right now. Van Kampen continues, the writer gives the following account of the invasion of Israel by Antiochus and of Israel's willingness to make peace with him at any cost. So we're reading about now in the book of the Maccabees, the account of Antiochus, who is a forerunner, a shadow, a prototype of the future despot known as the Antichrist. And with the perspective that we're using, which is kind of known as prophetic telescoping, near, far, now, and not yet, we're seeing that Daniel is given details about this wicked ruler and his dealings with Israel. And many of the details that Daniel's given are going to be utilized to foretell what Antichrist himself is going to do. So we have dual purpose to a prophecy. We have God giving details to Daniel once, and yet they only partially get fulfilled in Antiochus. They get completely or totally fulfilled in Antichrist. So we have the partial fulfillment earlier on in Antiochus, and we have the total fulfillment in Antichrist in the future. That's the way we're utilizing this part of our study at the moment. Let's look at the book of Maccabees. And there came out of them a wicked root, Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes, son of Antiochus the king. In those days went there out of Israel wicked men who persuaded many fellow Israelites, saying, and this is the account that we're reading about in the book of Maccabees, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the heathen that are round about us, for since we departed from them, we have had much sorrow. The address is 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 10 through 11. So notice right away that the account in the book of Maccabees describes the relationship that ancient Israel is entering into with this wicked ruler, this Antiochus figure. And they're saying, let's make a covenant with, these are Jews, by the way, Jewish people in the few centuries before Christ. They're saying, let's make this covenant with this Gentile ruler, this Syrian ruler, this Greek-Syrian ruler, because if we do so, he's at least going to spare us the persecution from his own armies. And as long as we kind of go along with his program, then the non-Jews around us aren't going to persecute us. And so it's kind of like the Jewish people are capitulating and they're giving in. They're backpedaling on the covenant that they made with God to be different from the surrounding nations. Instead, they're compromising on their relationship with God by saying, let's just give in and relax a little bit. Do we have to be different from the world? Do we have to be separated and holy unto God? I mean, it always brings trouble, always brings persecution. Let's just kind of give in to the surrounding circumstances and go with the flow for a little bit, and things will be a little easier for us. And so that becomes the kind of the picture of what's going to happen when Antichrist comes onto the scene as well in the 70th week of Daniel. Earlier on, as we enter into the final 7-year period of the transition from this age into the age to come, and into the transition of the kingdom of God here on earth, these last 7 years that we're describing with the 70th week of Daniel picture is that Antichrist is going to enter into some type of agreement with Israel again, and he's going to broker some type of treaty between Israel and her surrounding neighbors, whether it be the Arabs or that surround her, or the Muslim groups around her, or even the Gentile world around her. He's going to make it possible that peace in the Middle East will finally be actualized at a level that has never, ever been witnessed by the world at large. And so this will kind of clue us, those of us who are Bible students and are watching world events, but we're reading our Bible first and foremost. This should help us understand, hey, we've seen this before. So let's pick this theme up with Ben Kampen's notes here. That covenant with Antiochus closely parallels the covenant that Daniel predicted Antichrist will make with Israel at the beginning of the 70th week. That's exactly what I just said. If I would have just kept reading, I wouldn't have had to stop and explain everything. Notice this quote from Daniel 9. And he, speaking of Antichrist, will make a firm covenant with the many, that is Israel, for 1 week. That's Daniel 9:27. That is Van Kampen reminds us, that is, for the final 7-year period, during the last half of which Antichrist will wreak the greatest persecution of all time upon the earth. So that's why we're studying through Antiochus right now. We're not really so much going through a history lesson. I hope you guys are catching this, right? This is not about becoming better historians. This is so that we can use what Yeshua himself kind of hinted at when he told his disciples, and now us by inclusion, because we're reading the words that he left behind. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, right? This was given to us in Matthew 24. What the master was informing us is that past history is going to help you understand the future events that are about to come. Of course, a lot of what Yeshua told them, his disciples in Matthew there in the Olivet Discourse, which we'll get to in time, a lot of what he told them took place shortly thereafter during the siege of the temple in 70 AD, the destruction of the temple, and the siege of Jerusalem in the following in the 130s. So they, the people of Israel who were preparing themselves using the words of the master, were using not just past events to, like Antiochus, to also prepare them for what was taking place then, but also we realize that now, 2,000 years later, as we begin to realize that Israel's now settled back in her land again, she got kicked out, but now she made her way back by God's grace. And now that she's back in the land, that events are shaping up that are going to be actualized in the 70th week of Daniel as it unfolds before our very eyes in these days that we're living in, which I believe are fast approaching. I could be wrong. Could be another 50 or 100 years down the road, but it doesn't seem like that. The state of affairs in the world today, the temperature, if you might want to call it, of current affairs, just seems to be rapidly going in the direction of we're probably going to see prophetic events begin to unfold probably within a generation, really. I could be wrong, but we need to be prepared either way. Let's keep reading Van Kampen. He states, many Jews other than the faithful remnant, the woman, were so eager to please Antiochus and to avoid persecution that they not only forsook the Mosaic law, but even their racial identity and heritage, considering themselves from then on to be Gentiles. So there's this phenomenon known as Epispasm, where the males sought to reverse the physical marks of physical circumcision, right? Without getting too graphic, you guys have to kind of understand what I'm saying there. Those of you who are adults and listening to this podcast and watching this YouTube video. So, but either way, what ancient Israel was doing was they were flirting with the enemy in an effort to secure some form of peace and safety, at least from their perspective. We're going to find out from other passages, like such as the book of Isaiah, that God was watching all of this right back in Antiochus' day, and he's going to watch what Israel's going to do in the future with Antichrist. And God describes it as a covenant of death. And the reason it's called that is on a number of levels, but some of the reasons are that Israel is making an agreement not with God, her protector, for life, a covenant where God promised to protect her if they would be obedient to him and trust him and follow in his ways. Instead, Israel's deciding to take matters into their own hands, entering into agreements with the surrounding leaders with her, which, on the surface level is not wrong in the sense of, you want to have peace with your neighbors, so you got to have some kind of talk. But the point is, God is seeing through to the heart and the motives of Israel. Why are you doing what you're doing? You don't trust me. God has it in his program to protect Israel and to bring her into a place of peace and safety ultimately. But God realizes that Israel is dealing and working with an uncircumcised heart, a heart of disbelief. And so God's allowing Israel to take these actions ultimately so that he can bring her to the crucible. He can put her into the pressure cooker and bring her to a place where she is broken and on her knees and crying out for forgiveness to the God that she has forsaken. Let's keep reading Van Kampen. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Let's try that again. So we have a quote here from the book of Maccabees. Once again, this is Van Kampen. The plan seemed good in their eyes, And some of the people went eagerly to the king, and he authorized them to introduce practices of the heathen. Now, let me interject. What's the big deal about Israel just adopting some of the practices of the heathen? Well, you and I both know that God expressly forbade Israel from mimicking the practices of the surrounding nations. Right? God singled out Israel as a special covenant people, like what I was talking about with my members in the live study with me now before the study started. God singled out Israel to be the recipient of specialized revelation, not just generalized revelation that God gave to the entire world about, prohibitions against murder and incest and adultery and prohibitions against just overtaking people groups and doing whatever you want. Israel was singled out with specialized revelation that included details that only Israel was privy to because she was the one that was given the Torah at Mount Sinai. God didn't bring all of the Egyptians to Mount Sinai and give them the Torah. He separated his people from the Egyptians in the Exodus story, brought Israel to the foot of Sinai. Israel at this point in time, which was composed of native-born sons of Jacob, as well as those who had left Egypt from the surrounding nations. So Israel was already at that point in time a bouquet of surrounding people groups, but covenantally they were still Israel. He brought them to the foot of Sinai to give them specialized instructions for showcasing and highlighting the plans that God was going to give to the rest of the world. But Israel became the servants. Israel became the butlers of God's family to serve the rest of the world. And so in this plan that we're reading about in the book of Maccabees, where Israel decided to adopt some of the practices of the surrounding nations, stop circumcising their sons, stop keeping the Sabbath, and start enjoying some of the other festivals that the surrounding nations are doing, this was displeasing to God on multiple levels, but it marred the image that God had for Israel. God had set them apart as a covenant people, separate and distinct from the people groups, to be a light to the surrounding nations. And if they were just going to do what the surrounding nations were doing, then they weren't going to be a witness. And so we're going to see that this is supposed to inform us of what the Antichrist is going to get Israel to do in the future. Somehow he's going to get them to, on the one hand, enter an agreement with the surrounding nations so they can have some semblance of peace. At the same time, we see that a lot of Israel is going to apostatize and to begin to forsake the covenant again, just like they did before. Israel will become more secular in that sense. So that we'll have the ultra-religious in Israel that are going to, start doing the sacrifices, and, there'll be that minority. But the majority of Israel seems to probably be going in the direction of, do we really need the law of Moses? It's such an antiquated document. If we can just adopt some of the practices of the surrounding nations, the surrounding Muslim groups and Arab groups, maybe we can start keeping parts of Quran. Who knows? We can have some peace with our neighbors, and they'll let us up on the Temple Mount and do whatever. Who knows? Those are things that those are discussions that we're entertaining at the moment.